And Katherine, here. Good morning, everybody, or mid-morning, and I am delighted to be here. I'm Mayra Buvinic, and I have been with Data2X part-time for a long time now. So this session, I think, and sort of with the background of the comment from our friend from the Ford Foundation in the last session, I think it's a good segue for this session, because this session is about something that Data2X feels very strongly, that data has to be for something, and that we should not produce data if data is not going to increase knowledge, and if knowledge is not going to affect policy. So the link between data, knowledge, and policy is critical. Unfortunately, in the gender and development field, we have a lot of data gaps, but increasingly we have a lot of data, but that there is knowledge, and more importantly, are there effective policies is another question. So, to say that, the session will talk about the enabling environment. How can we turn the environment around so that data will lead to knowledge and to policy? And I am delighted to have here, I think, people who really have done a tremendous amount for data, for the production of data, innovative data, and particularly gender data. And first, to my left, is Sunita Kishor. She is director of the DHS, the Demographic and Health Surveys. And I must say that the Demographic and Health Surveys have really provided the best and most objective information on women and girls to date in the countries that they have been able to do surveys. Really, the contribution of Sunita and of the Demographic Health Surveys cannot be underestimated. It has been really at the forefront for data, good data on women and girls. Sandy Pentland is the project director of the Media Lab, Media Entrepreneurship Lab at MIT, and obviously, the Media Lab is incredibly well known on doing innovative data work. And finally, Katherine Hay is the Deputy Director of the Gender Equalities at the Gates Foundation. And clearly, I don't know if it has been Bill, but I'm sure it has been Melinda that has put the financial resources and her visibility behind gender data. And I think that we are here, I think, today because of the efforts of Melinda Gates. So welcome to the three of you. And I will start with Sunita. And, we've been talking already, we've been seeing sort of the integration of the data sources, the traditional or conventional set data sources and the big data sources are incredibly important. What are the strengths of integrating data sources? What are the issues respecting to gender data? And particularly respecting to, within your own demographic and health surveys, the DHS objectives.
I think it's on. Yeah. I have a loud voice anyway, so thank you so much. I'm really happy to be on this panel and to discuss some of the issues that I see and the strengths of what this new, well, it's about 10 years old, I imagine, but the field, how it's growing and how it's integrating. Sitting at the DHS, which is right now being talked of as a more traditional data source, I would argue that increasingly integration is happening. Not only is the DHS providing that ground truthing for big data, but in fact, traditional data sources like the DHS is also, we too are using big data in many different ways, including for enhancing our ability to provide data at lower and lower levels without actually having to do the interviewing at those levels. So some of the the FlowMinder gentleman from FlowMinder had just shown us what they were doing, we have been using for some time and producing as part of our data releases, spatial data surfaces that allow us to look at some of the indicators at lower levels. Those indicators, however, could not, from our point of view, have been produced without the data from the DHS itself, the indicators from the DHS, and combined with covariates that come out of big data, and of course, satellite imagery, et cetera, that allows us to map it. Having said all of this, I think we still need to remember that some of the principles that we live by at the DHS, and I've been with the DHS for a very, very long time, and a lot of the gender work that has come out of the DHS, I was hired to do back in 1993 when we were still talking of women in development rather than gender issues. But I think what has made it possible for us are some of the current still weaknesses in big data. One of them was always the idea of ethical data collection and the safety of women. We faced a lot of problems in getting data on domestic violence, for example, when we first started. Not only resistance from countries and governments that we don't have a problem, why should we be looking at this? But also, how do you protect women when you're collecting those data? How do you protect the interviewers, who also tend to be women? How do you train them when they themselves are bringing their own life experiences to that interviewing process? Dealing with a lot of those sorts of ethical issues, things which we need to always keep in mind when we are looking at data, does raise some concerns about the big data themselves. Because some of the information that is most complementary to DHS data really is that nitty-gritty data on, when you're looking at Facebook or you're looking at Twitter, you're looking at comments, you are actually getting down to opinions of individuals. But that is exactly the kind of data that can be widely misused and misrepresented. So I think, information on satellite imagery or covariates, weather, roads, distances, forest cover, lights, etc., that's information that we are less worried about from an ethical perspective. However, if we really need to get down to what's happening within households, I think a lot of the issues that the DHS has faced over the years in trying to keep confidentiality and ethical sort of not just generation of data, but also use of data becomes central. And I think that's where the meeting of the two sort of streams of data, that intersection remains something that we still have to work on.
Great. Just before we turn to Sandy. I just heard, are you now gathering digital phone data in the DHS?
No.
Okay.
We aren't. We do have questions, by which we have information, meaning are we going to be asking questions? Yes, we are.
You are?
Yeah. I mean, we've just been through the latest revision of the DHS questionnaire. Many of you in this room probably participated in it because we make it open and we solicit comments from, we got suggestions for 984 new questions.
We counted for a couple of them.
But who's counting? Yes, right. Yeah.
But without removing any, but that's okay. That was the entire purpose. What are the key issues? And of course, our response within the DHS is always, our purpose, our existence is to help meet emerging data needs. So obviously, this is a big area.
Great. Thank you. So, your comments just segue right into the question for Sandy in terms of data governance models, inclusive models at the international and national level, sort of stakeholders, actors, and sort of getting a gender lens into these models. Do you have a PowerPoint or you're not?
I have some slides, but we can lose it if you want. It's
Okay,
fine.
I think the slides are.
Oh, look at that.
there.
Okay, well, so we
Yeah,
won't do
we
too much
are-
with it then. So I run a group at MIT.
If you want to,
Wow. Which does both basic research, and we build systems, and we do policy. So that's me. The president of the EU invited me to lecture all the ministers of the single digital market in the EU on how to safely have access to data, like phone data and things like that. And Eurostat just adopted our recommendations for all of Europe. Which is cool. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Oh, sorry, folks out there. And we build software too. For instance, one of our spin-offs handles 10% of all the live births in the entire world, providing information services to them, which is, pretty good. But the part that I think wanted to talk about today is how you turn this into political power. Because as the person from back there was asking, how do you actually get advocacy? And, one of the things that is a problem is that even if you have rights over your own data, it doesn't do you much good. You could sort of look at yourself, but you need collective action to be able to have political power. And what we've discovered, and I have a bunch of lawyers that are part of my group, is that there are certain sorts of cooperatives which are licensed by law to manage people's data. So for instance, just by accident in the United States, credit unions are licensed to manage your digital identity, which is basically everything about you. They act as your legal representative. They don't own your data. They hold your data for you. They act as your lawyer, as it were. And they could, for instance, and we've built software to do this, you just sort of check a little box and your credit union would download all your data, for instance, your medical data. Why would you care? So imagine in a city you could get 100,000 people to download their medical data. Then the people themselves could look at their data and ask, are the medical services being provided effective? The medical service guys aren't going to tell you that. The drug companies aren't going to tell you that. The politicians may or may not tell you that. But if you can determine it for yourself, then you can demand change, fact-based change. Or if you're a labor union, are you being paid fairly? Is pay across gender equal? Well, it's very hard to know. But if you can have people in control of their own data, you can answer those questions extremely concretely and actually rather cheaply as well. So this is sort of the warpath that I'm on, is I want to get cooperatives up around the world. And we're working with World Association of Labor Unions and credit unions and so forth. And I'd like to see more sort of women's co-ops like Siwa and people like that to begin taking control of their data, and we can provide a little bit of software and legal help for that, so that they can advocate in a very concrete way with data about issues that they care about. And I think that's the way to disrupt things. This is what happened back around 1900 with labor. There were a few big companies that owned everything, and they abused labor, and what did people do? They gathered in local cooperatives, formed labor unions, and pushed back. And it took 20 years or so, at least, right? But eventually, government got in there and backed up the unions, and they were fairly effective. Earlier, you may not realize it, but earlier the same issue was with banks. It used to be that banks were a big scam, and so typically farmers formed agricultural cooperatives so that they could lend to themselves and push back. And for instance, in the United States, that was the source of huge political dissent around 1870 You might have heard of the Cross of Gold speeches, William Jennings Bryant. That was an agricultural revolution by agricultural cooperatives called the Grange. So now's the time to do it for data. It's your
So-
time.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? Is this just for big data or for all data?
All data.
All data.
I have some one-pagers I brought and put on that table over there. So if you're interested, pick it up. It has sort of pointers to things. Okay?
Because it seemed to me that
Should be all data. Yeah. Well, for instance, the sort of data that you were talking about is absolutely critical to any big data thing because your data is sometimes is the ground truth. You've put an enormous amount of energy into what is the gold standard, and big data typically has to be calibrated and validated. And what do you calibrate and validate against? Well, the sorts of things that you produce. Right?
Great. Let's go to Katherine and sort of the potential of big data to monitor progress on gender equality and evaluate impacts. I think it's something that we haven't done very much, but if you can sort of tell us your thoughts on it.
I think it's low, actually, to be honest, as I don't think that's where the power of it, in my mind, is immediate. So if I'm thinking about sort of initial investments or where would I be putting my resources, it's interesting because we're partnering with the Self-Employed Women's Association to help them make better use of their data. So we should definitely chat afterwards. But the reason I say that is that not because I don't think that there's a lot of interesting work to be done on big data, and I think that there is interesting research and exploration, and I think that when we talk about bringing in more perspectives into that work, I don't think it's only in sort of northern academic institutions and having, I think people are using sex and gender like they're kind of conflating them today, but I don't think it's just that diversity, but it's also about who's doing it in low, middle income countries, who's doing it on the ground. I think we've seen in terms of other innovations, whether it's, say, user-centered design, where you'll have like user-centered design students sort of fly in and land at a place like Sewa and spend like 2 weeks on a project. And I think we just need to get better also. So, I mean, I really agree with everything people are saying about bringing more diversity into academic programs here. But also, I think just even thinking more broadly about diversity and trying to bring some of the tools closer to the people on the ground who are in that context and who can be thinking and designing around use. So I think there's a lot of interesting space there. I also think that there's a really important need for feminist theorists and critics around data privacy. I mean, if we look at the states that we're working in, I mean, to assume that they, surveillance has been used to sort of target women and their bodily integrity long before big data. But I think that when we're seeing things like, I mean, we're in the 100th day now of the internet shutdown in Kashmir. When we're thinking about like the idea that of benevolence or neutrality in terms of sort of data, access to data, et cetera, I think we have to be realistic here. So in my mind, investing also in those critics in country who will raise their voice, who will look at the negatives and bring balance to that, so that that societies are sort of looking at these, including with a feminist and a gender lens, and looking at sort of minorities and who's excluded and who's at risk also. But on the question of monitoring and evaluation, you know, so I've worked a lot with state governments in India in particular. There's a lot of data on like the nature of problems. If you just take the DHS data, I mean, you can get dashboards, district level, subnational dashboards that look at sort of vulnerability, child marriage. We've run on top of like the amazing work with the NFHS, the DHS data in India, that gives you amazing data actually on the nature of gender inequities and burdens, health burdens on women, violence, etc. We've also run I think quite interesting surveys on doing thousands of observations, direct observations of deliveries of reproductive health sanitation service, sterilization services. I can tell you, I mean, just knowing those, having that information, it's not as though like at sort of the district or sub-district level, policymakers are able to then just designed differently, right? I mean, the nature of government's not great at sort of designing like a different program for every single municipality. And so if we're expecting that even having sort of a dashboard of say, early marriage or vulnerability, if it's an index, to expect that that will then lead to sort of a solution, like that data will be acted on so quickly, is naive, right? Because we already have a lot of good data of that nature of describing the problem, right? So to say like transport is unsafe or, you know, primary schools, there's an enrollment challenge, those same places that don't have good service statistics or good data to begin with to manage those government programs probably lack the capacity to then, now that they somehow know that in these difficult regions, enrollment is a challenge, or you have like a low breastfeeding level, or you've got high NMR, I mean, you still have the same governance challenges that is why they don't have good service statistics to begin with, to then expect them to then implement and change their programs, I think is a little naive. And so, you know, when I'm hearing a lot of like, knowing this nature of the problem, or knowing the levels of violence, or knowing these things now will create sort of a, you know, a miracle will happen and somebody will act on that data, I think we have to move beyond that. So I think we have to be really, for me, the more exciting space is less about the M&E, because I feel like big data is still in sort of first generation questions, not even of like what's leading to what, but really just describing that there's an inequity and trying to get better at being as good at describing it as existing methods. It's not even there yet in terms of sort of being able to compete with what I would call traditional methods in terms of just understanding the nature of some of these problems. That said, like, keep innovating, because maybe it will get better at it and be able to describe the problems much more cheaply. I mean, we're nowhere near there in my mind yet, but that's, I think, the science to be done. But I think the solutions are more who can respond to more bespoke data. I think it's individuals. And so I think there's probably, for me, I'm more excited about the potential in the shorter term, like 5 to 10 years, of big data being used and generated through applications that women's activists, movements, collectives are developing for themselves to solve their problems. And then the potential of that data to sort of inform those solutions for sort of individual women or activists or collectives. And so I think for me, that's where I would expect to see sort of more, more promising interventions that actually lead to change on the ground in the short run.
So very much with Sandy, I think, you know, sort of is giving the data to the individuals themselves, to the women themselves, and raising political power. I'm going to make a sort of a general question for the three of you, and it's the same sort of, what else can we do to really encourage the translation of data into useful knowledge and into policy or action? Yes, Andy, go ahead. Well,
I'm going to use this just for a second. I have an unfair advantage. Oh, no, maybe I don't have an unfair advantage. Okay, well. Is that it? Yes. So we did a thing recently where we looked at place inequality. So how are each of the places in your city unequal? Who goes there, right? And we discovered some things that I think really changed the discussion, at least for us, which is that most of the segregation in the U.S. and also in other societies we've looked at are not the result of zoning and where people live. It's a function of individual choices in the moment. And of course, there are social norms that inform those. And so that is a different sort of lens for looking at this. And the reason it matters is because this sort of access to different opportunities is directly predictive of things like income, health, and other things. So it gives a somewhat different lens. And so what I would argue is the other thing that you want to do is you want to have research about this. You want to have research about what are the problems? How does the human animal work? How does society work? What is it that's actually happening? And you want to do interventions also experimental interventions. So JPAL, for instance, at MIT, Harvard, and so forth, that does randomized controlled trials of different policies is the sort of thing that I think we need to do, because I don't think we understand ourselves and our problems to the extent that we'd like to.
Great, Sunita.
I absolutely agree. At the ground level, just to comment on the what would make a government act. And what our experience with the DHS has been is, first and foremost, trust in the data. And that is whatever that source of data is. If the government can, and most governments are thinking about if it's at all subject to a re-election or whatever it is, the idea that if I accept this data, what does it say about us at this point? I mean, having worked with ministries of health and having, most of the time we are working with the governments, right? And they are the ones who generate the data. We provide technical assistance to them. So trust and ownership, right? They've got to feel that this is their data. That's where I think we still have a problem with big data, that it's not necessarily owned by the people who are going to be using it. And this speaks to, a lot of your points. But that's not just it. What's also important is, how do you motivate governments? Because we've been talking about evidence-based policy making since for the last 30 years. That was USAID's, and, that was the slogan, that what we need to be doing is all data, that when we are producing data, it should go into the policy making. It should form the basis of policy and programs. But there's no push. And that's where I think governance and active, the movements, whether it's gender movements or environmental movements, make a huge difference. It will still take years, because we have been producing gender data on, say, violence for what? Some of our consistent data has been since about 1999, 2000. We have seen changes in attitudes towards violence. We have hardly seen changes in actual domestic violence. Clearly, despite the push that we have said, if you are going to if we are producing the data, show us what action you're going to take with it, has not really worked. You get these tip of the iceberg information, and that's what I worry about gender data. Big data, that what we are getting is a description. We're not getting the why or what we do with it, or, where do we go with it. You're studying, it's very powerful, but what you're studying is what are people doing? We don't know. It's descriptive. It's a numerator, right? But to get governments to do something about it, that's where people come in. Because the data, despite huge gaps in data, there is a lot of data that could be acted on.
Yeah,
Katherine.
and just to build on that, I was definitely not trying to suggest that government doesn't want to act also, right? So if you take DHS analysis in India, that will show that son preference would mean that in your third, if you've had two girls, the likelihood of you using contraceptives or family planning becomes really low, right? So there's that strong son preference. So let's say taking that information, knowing that there's this strong son preference. What do I now do as, say, the district collector in a particular area? So knowing the nature of a problem doesn't give you the solution, right? And so what I'm saying is there's both a challenge of, I think there's some ways that you can get actions, but sometimes I think this hope that more and more granular data, so I've worked on dashboards going from sort of district level, sort of hot spot kinds of issues, right down to at the primary health center, knowing, what the quality issues are there. But then being able to act on it. So if you know that in your area women aren't coming for institutional deliveries, for example, I mean, you can have that piece of information, know that, say, breastfeeding rates are low, know that a particular community is not getting the services, but then to be able to actually act on it is, you don't know what the solutions are. So there's that. That was what I sort of trying to get at. Like, we're unraveling and getting more and more specific on the nature of the problem and describing the problem, but that doesn't necessarily, and then hoping somebody else can figure out like what the solution is, right? I think then the other piece, though, where there is room for more change is that without having those precise technical solutions for every particular challenge that you're facing, with an algorithm telling the government official, like, now do this because your data suggests you should be focused on the breastfeeding, don't worry about the child marriage. I mean, even if we got to that point, which, I think is just not how the world works, I do think that there is space to strengthen that contract between, say, the government and citizens. And that's more about expectations of quality, expectations of services, and building a sort of service mindset where you want to deliver good services. And I think that can be a space where if citizens are more able to both change their perception of what is quality, like if you ask somebody, like, did you have to wait too long for services? They may say no, but their expectation may be that they have to wait for 6 hours, right? So, whereas if you start to change the expectations of citizens in terms of what government is meant to deliver, and then that too with government, I do think that's a space where data can play a role, which is a little bit of a different path than the idea that sort of more and more granularity combined with algorithms using things like list, or using things to sort of prioritize what's the best return on investment in terms of lives saved, et cetera, for taking this path or that path. I think that's less likely to yield kind of progress in the short term. It's kind of the precision medicine version of like development. I think it is more on the citizen holding government accountable and strengthening that sort of contract between citizens and government.
So we're talking about social contracts between governments and citizens, and data evidence being part of that feeds into the social contract and brings back accountability. On the gender and development field, and for us, and some of us who have been here for a very long time, there has been a resistance of many feminist organizations to quantitative data. And I think that I would like comments on that, and how can we inform better those people who are going to be activists and play that critical role in the social contract. But yes, Sandy, you have.
So it's clear that just having data that isn't controversial allows you to get to the next argument, but I have a rather cynical view. So having good data lets you get to the further in the discussion, but I have a rather cynical view of government, okay? So in most cases, you have to be in the interest of the individual who makes the decision. So they have to feel like their career is being advanced by this and that they're not at risk. So for instance, in India, administrative officers serve for 2 years. They have to do something that will get them that promotion at the end of each 2 years. And you can't use certain sorts of money because it counts against you, and et cetera. Or like when we were talking about GDPR, the argument for the government side was that they were going to be heroes, right? Okay. But the argument for the industry side is they weren't going to get stamped out of existence. They were going to be seen as being participants so that they could see some white space in all of this, right? And really thinking about it in this very cynical way and asking, what can you do, and can you get them to experiment also? That's another thing, not to bet the whole farm, but to say this is something that we're going to try to show that we're innovative, but it's not, like we've put our whole reputation on it. Because if they put their whole reputation on it, nothing's going to change. You don't get fired for doing just the same stuff.
Sunita, you have.
Um, India is, of course, dominates a little bit because the data in India is actually so granular, since it's the only country in which you've got 700,000 households being interviewed. So you are able to give data at the district level. But India is also pretty spectacular in terms of how they've used the data. Because, whether it's Supreme Court decisions that have the whole, child marriage, the more recent Supreme Court decision around, invalidating child marriages, was in part driven by the fact that the data is still out, it's out there. The entire movement for cheaper sanitary pads, for example, and you came out of a lot of the menstrual hygiene questions that were unique to the India DHS, which, by the way, we have adopted for the new round of the DHS for other countries too. So there are many examples. Nutrition, when the data had come out way back in the 2005-06 survey, from Sen, Amartya Sen, all the way to other local agencies, there was a huge push and huge pressure on Prime Minister of that time to do something about the huge amount of malnutrition. So data can move things, but part of it was exactly this, the risk to the prime ministership, or the fact that India, the nutrition data in India was poor, not the data quality, but the actual values were so much worse than, say, most of the African countries. And that somehow, the outward face of India was compromised in a way because of that. And so there is always this push, but this, going back to the idea of the contract, I think accountability, you've got to be able to push for accountability, because data is not going to do it on its own. And absolutely, I think, moving forward, maybe one of the possibilities with big data is, if we understand certain things better at that granular level, we may be able to think of solutions which, the much more sort of household level data is not being able to provide you.
Katherine?
I'm just going to come back to your question on sort of feminists and activists and sort of resistance to quantitative data. And I think it also connects a little bit to that point on sort of what's happening in the household. I think some of the criticisms and fears are well-founded. And I think if we think about, somebody mentioned feminist data science, every new method, then you add feminist at the front. But what that essentially means is thinking about power, right? Thinking about power in the use of that methodology and tool. And it's those questions of who decides the questions, who decides what's worth looking at, what research matters, who decides how to make sense of that, like who decides what whose experiences are valid versus just like outliers, and who is that for, and whose lives does that transform? And I think that we can see the risk of some of these new methods where you're not even necessarily having to talk to real people about their experience. You're looking for some signal that's left in the environment about their experience to try to understand their experience, as opposed to trying to understand it with them. Who are they setting the questions and driving the research agenda? Are they using the findings of this new methodology? And I think if the answer is sort of no, 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 and no, then I think they're also right to push back and say that this is not a science that is feminist in that respect. And so I think. And I think that's where kind of my earlier comment around sort of bringing it closer, understanding what's going on in the household, speaking to people, having them make sense of their own experience and be part of that research process in a meaningful way is something that we've just not advanced over the last several decades across multiple methodologies. And I think that I'll be I think that there is scope to do sort of big data, machine learning, AI differently. But I think unless that's very, very intentional, it's unlikely to be different. And in fact, it offers more opportunities to be sitting in a place like this and doing analysis without ever having to even interact with somebody on the ground. And so, I mean, I think they're fair critiques, and I think that I think feminist activists know the risks of being in opposition. And so they're probably very aware of how data can be used against the vulnerable. So, I mean, I think, we should look at those critiques very seriously and find a way to engage with them.
2 minutes, and then I think I want to open it to the audience.
So this general attitude of AI being something that drives systems seems to be problematic. On the other hand, AI that enables people to do existing things better and have those conversations, I think is good. For instance, the Gates Foundation is the one that supported these tools for bringing IT services to mothers in India and Western Africa that now allows nurse midwives to know the correct history when they walk into that room and to be able to contact experts, find the resources they need. Those are AI tools that help, women with very low education who are working as nurse midwives to service 10% of the births in the world. Okay, so that's a tool that enables more appropriate conversations, I think. And it may exclude some conversations, that's true. But I think that what we need to do is think about things that enhance that conversation, not things that replace it.
And I think, again, my comment was neutral on tool. My point is on who is deciding, who is funding, who's making the decision. So it can be tool neutral, right? And so what I'm saying is that local people, marginalized people, are generally the topics of research instead of being driving it. So I'm just saying an AI is no different, is all I'm saying, that you have to be intentional about changing that.
Okay, we have yet to sort of cover other topics that I wanted to cover, including the financing of all this, including one of the things that I think some of the attributes of big data. I mean, and one of the big things is, when you answer a questionnaire, there may be biased responses. Big data overcomes that, right? Or it can overcome that, particularly for certain, feelings responses. But anyway, I will turn it to the audience because I think we want to get questions from the audience before we break for lunch. Yes. There's 1 and 2,
3 here.
and 3. And maybe I'll take like a couple of questions or 2, 3 questions at a time, and then we go to the panelists, and then we do another round.
Where would you like to start, Mayra?
Here, okay, we start.
Hello, my name's Julia. I'm a student at Columbia. I wanted to say that I really liked Katherine's point of including social people, like leaders of social movements and activists, into these conversations, because I think they're the ones that really drive social change as well as policy ultimately. So my question has kind of been sort of alluded in some of the discussions that were being placed, but mostly about how do we include these leaders into these into the generating of big data as well as in the handling of big data, when there probably is a lot of skepticism as well as fear from these leaders, because technology has been used to kind of silence these voices, from surveillance on protesters and Black Lives Matter activists and things like that, from censorship in different countries. So yeah, just like making sure that we can invite them into these discussions without further marginalizing them.
Great. Let's take another question.
I'm in the same line as your comment. Big data is also used to stop women from executing their rights. So women on waves, women on web who support women who need abortion all over the world have been blocked by all the credit card companies. So whatever country you come from, you try to pay, they make payment impossible. So there needs to be another solidarity where the big data is also used against empowerment of women. And I don't know how it should be, but to have solidarity in a big data era, it's quite a question. How are we going to do this? This is my question to the panel.
Okay, and the third question, and we're going to take Bapu. You have a...
Am I allowed?
You are allowed.
Katherine, do you worry about foundations as a source of unelected power in determining the agenda of this? And to Sandy, very quickly, I'm fascinated by this data cooperatives idea. Seeing the two words together feels like a revelation, actually. In terms of data like social media data and cell phone data, the other kinds the researchers were talking about that seem to be kind of at the front lines of global development, it seems they're a little bit outside of the aegis of credit unions and labor unions. So how do you collectively organize or cooperatively organize ownership of that kind of data?
Okay, so why don't we turn it over? Katherine, you want to start?
Sure, let me start. Do I worry about the power of private foundations on like big data types of questions?
As setting the agenda for how this, even for how do you include people? Do the foundations get to decide how people are included?
So I definitely worry about the power of, and this is me now as an individual, obviously, perhaps. I definitely worry about the power of individual foundations in shaping a whole lot of things. And I think that it's also fairly particular to the United States and the way that the tax system and philanthropy hasn't evolved also, that you get such an amount of wealth moving arguably out of the tax base into and being used. There's a long history that's sort of been well analyzed in terms of the role of and the evolution of philanthropy in the United States. And I do think that you have a very different accountability system. I mean, the previous grant-making organization that I worked for was a Canadian Crown Corporation that had an international board of governors, so there was accountability both to taxpayers in Canada as well as to this international board, and that's very different than having individuals, very well-intentioned, very committed individuals, but that's the accountability is ultimately to them. And so I do think that it's important to think of other ways to sort of check that and bring accountability. And I think we're seeing through social media that citizens are, a powerful voice also. Is it enough? I mean, I think it's an important question, especially, again, one that I think in the United States needs to be considered in terms of sort of that accumulation of wealth and then sort of these debates around who's best placed to spend that effectively and to redistribute that. In terms of on big data in particular, I would say that, I mean, I can speak more to the Gates Foundation. I would say that there's a lot of, I think there's a sense that development in general, implementation is very expensive. I mean, the Gates Foundation has like nothing compared to like the budgets of like the government of India. I mean, so there's no role really, I think, for philanthropic capital in sort of large scale delivery of programs. And so I think that the value add arguably is in sort of the innovation space. We can overinvest in data and measurement in ways that it's harder for governments, right? Because the trade-off for them of not delivering in order to understand better is a harder trade-off. So we do tend to partner with state governments, with national governments to sort of try and strengthen those data systems, because I think we can, I mean, philanthropic capital is able to overinvest. And I think that in all of my experiences, it's been very much done in partnership with government. And so I guess you get that level of accountability. But if I could just, while I have the mic, maybe talking a little bit about sort of the other space that I think is interesting for philanthropic capital, and I think it is also in these sort of innovation spaces and trying to think about bringing different stakeholders together who might not otherwise be working together. And so bringing data scientists together with groups like SEWA, and then looking at, can we also build data scientists in SEWA, so that it's not sort of always this model of kind of trying to fly people in from other spaces, but actually build more of that capacity within those spaces. I think just also trying to push for kind of very utilization focused or applied forms of kind of transdisciplinarity, but also bringing different disciplines, but also different experiences and realities and expertise. So movements, together with different types of disciplinary expertise to try to solve real problems. So I also think that how do you do that is really tough, actually, and I don't think there's a lot of resources for innovation there. And I think, but I do think that that is also a space where philanthropic capital and also like crowdfunding can also try and support more innovation. But I'd love to hear what people are doing and trying on those fronts of sort of bringing together these different allied stakeholders to work together, because I do think we need more models that are sustainable and that are very, focused on sort of the declining and the clawback on women's rights and minority rights and a whole range of issues, including reproductive rights.
Sunita, you want to comment?
Yeah, I think it has been a big struggle, really, to try and square the idea of big data always being beneficial. And that we know not to be true. I mean, every day there's something in the news about, AI or big data itself somehow not, having not just a bias, but it actually can damage any kind of progress that we are making. But I also worry about the fact that of reinforcing stereotypes with big data, because big data can be descriptive. A lot of the motivations that are then assigned, two things in my mind happen, and this is not my area of expertise, but I did try and do a bit of reading before I came onto this panel, and it got me a little worried. I was worried on two grounds from a gender perspective. One is the effect of stereotyping how you model things. I mean, the stereotypical approach to what you would expect a woman and a man, the behaviors. But also, once you have the data, how you interpret the data using stereotypes, because you're not talking to the women and men. And it's equally, I think, problematic for men, but in particular, it's problematic for women because the whole idea of gender and the protection of women, or data, sensitive gender data, is something that is so sensitive to governments. There are things about it that they will not want to deal with at all. And therefore, it is so much easier to use stereotypes in explaining in what's happening. So we're not talking to women to find out why they may not be breastfeeding, or why it is that, the whole lived experience of, say, violence. We are just assuming certain things, and very often the explanation, if it doesn't come from the individual, is colored by our own beliefs, and that's not enough. That's not what the data are meant for. They're meant to really give us the truth. I put that in inverted commas because there is no truth.
So the systems that we try to advocate have it as a fundamental thing is to have total and complete auditing of data and data use. Today, people put data out there. You don't know what happens to it. That's crazy. You can fairly cheaply have systems that keep track of where every bit of personal data goes and who uses it and for what. And in the systems that we do, we call open algorithms. The algorithms are transparent. They're agreed on by the human community, and their performance is monitored continuously by the human community. And so that's really interesting because it's an opportunity to get a different set of stakeholders to the table with data. And so, for instance, in Latin America with the Inter-American Development Bank, we're going back, we've built design tools for their social programs to monitor fairness. And they're design tools. They're not like, this is the answer, AI. This is something where what it does is it takes gold standard data collected by hand, and it says, if you have these sorts of rules, you'll be unfair in these ways. Now you have, as a political process, to decide what's the right way to proceed, because you can't have it all, okay? And that discussion among the humans is actually the most valuable part of it. It's not the data. The data provokes the discussion. The data informs the discussion, right? But it's not itself the actor.
We have 5 minutes left, and I want to see if there's anybody else who has a question. Yes.
Hi, Sarah Beth Broccoli with BSR. Thank you all for the panel today. Our group heavily works in supply chains with women who work in agricultural chains and in factories, primarily in India and Bangladesh. And we're trying to figure out how to not just sexify the audit process, but one thing that does really work with businesses is to perform audits that don't necessarily work for women and don't capture that gender output. What we did do was work with SADEX to kind of redesign what gender-inclusive value chain should look like and develop a set of indicators. But like most toolkits and most things that are appropriately done by people far away, it sits. So in order to get to that deploying message, I wanted to know from the panel what types of partnerships that you saw took this idea of what data sets you were working with and deployed them through a population that was substantial and meaningful, and what excites you about the next few years in using a toolkit and having, like, I don't know, gender designed and inclusivity women asking women questions and what the landscape for that might be.
Do we have another question? Yes. Back there, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Hi, my name's Lauren Padilla. I analyze air quality data for Environmental Defense Fund, and my question is, to what extent does data need to be open for it to be actionable, and open to who? Does it have to be public-wide? We deal with some data that's collected by private companies, and they don't want to share it with the public, but is there an audience that, you know, and do you have examples of public-private partnerships that you might share?
Okay, Sandy, we start with you now.
So we're big advocates of open data. Open data threatens privacy if it's at the granular level. So we like to describe it as rich census data, where it's been aggregated enough that it's more safe to use. And often that's not of particular critical value to companies. But to answer my response to the question that was before is, the things that I see drive government are cost savings. Stop. That's it. In companies, risk reduction. I mean, if it's long-term profit, maybe, but risk reduction. And that's basically it. And then the third one, it's a friend of mine who had been president of Costa Rica and got a IT preparedness measure put into the World Economic Forum. And he said, look, the whole point of this is to embarrass the minister in front of his peers. It has nothing to do with anything else. It's to take that guy and embarrass him. And if he's embarrassed, he'll do something. And you know, so you can see the sort of a cynical view of the world here, but I think it works.
Katherine, you have any thoughts?
I mean, I think there's times when buying private data for particular use may make sense, but I mean, I think we're also big proponents of open data, open research, and you know, trying to make those public goods, especially when it's funded through public investment. Somewhere on the chain. to not have that be privatized, right? And it often is funded on sort of upstream public investment, public universities, et cetera, even if the collection is private. But again, I think it kind of depends on the solution or on the particular situation. In terms of sort of, that was a pretty, I feel like there's a lot in your question on value chains and unpacking. And I think there's been some interesting experiences more in sort of smallholder producers in terms of using sort of existing data on sort of market prices. And I've seen some of that work in interesting ways, including through collectives. But just to build on Sandy's comment, I'd say the other thing, in addition to cost reductions, that governments are focused on is also elections. And I think with the sort of electoral cycles in many countries seeming to be like perpetually ongoing, I've also seen sort of the growing recognition of women and their issues as electoral issues. And with more women voting in some contexts and sort of being more clear about what they're voting on, we've also seen sort of responses to that data being then used to inform sort of particular policies or programs. And I'm thinking right now, we're really drawing a lot on India, but thinking about the sort of electoral issue around alcohol, and so how that led to prohibition in Bihar, for example, which was largely in response to sort of women demanding that, including women in collectives. And so I think that's another space where, and in some ways your shaming incident is an electoral issue, right? That person cares because they have a direct impact. And so I think that data on sort of, what your constituencies want is also part of that sort of accountability channel. And it is one where I think, on top of the ones you mentioned, where there is attention to that data.
Sunita, last words?
Last words, okay.
Next to last.
Okay. I think addressing the issue of data use is critical. It's very fundamental. We've been producing data. I've said this before, despite the gaps, there is a lot of data that's actionable. How do we teach? How do we encourage? How do we persuade people to learn to use the data that's out there? And one of them, obviously, is first the whole idea of open data, open tools that are actually can be somehow integrated into the work that the people we are working with can do as part of their regular work, which is what we've tried to do within the DHS. Obviously, our reach is not, you reach a few people at a time, e-learning can help, etc. But to build it into the way people do their work. And for us, that is for statistical offices to actually use their own data, and we have to give them the tools to do it correctly, and to do it in an unbiased fashion. Because when you begin to use your own data, your own biases can also, if you're not a neutral party, your own biases can influence how women, what happens to women and what policies come out of it. When we first had the data on acceptance of violence against women, the newspapers way back, emblazoned with headlines which said, oh, women accept being beaten, and, it's coming from them. It's all about how you interpret, working with journalists, working with, I think that's where some of the pressure builds up. If all of us who are working in the data field are together or separately working with those for whom you're producing the data to actually learn to use the data and to use it in a way that remains fair and, not biased, I think that's where a lot of these things have to happen, because DHS reports also lie on people's shelves and are, protected behind closed glass doors. So that has to change.
Great. Thank you. Those were wonderful last words. I will just add that I think we started talking about the enabling environment, and basically, the bottom line of the enabling environment is a very strong, healthy social contract between citizens and the state. And I hate to end in a sort of not so positive note, but to find that many countries that have those kinds of very healthy social contracts and a vibrant democracy between citizens and the state are not that many. But anyway, but that I think is where we have to go to. An applause for the panelists, and I call Emily to give us instructions.